Jason Miller had lived on his sprawling 5-acre property in Lakewood Ridge for over a decade, enjoying the freedom of owning land that bordered a beautiful private lake. One of his prized possessions was his custom 28-foot fishing boat, a sleek, high-performance machine that he kept parked on his own land, well outside the jurisdiction of the HOA. Jason had intentionally never joined the HOA when he moved in, making sure his property was exempt from their ridiculous rules, and he had the paperwork to prove it. Despite this, the HOA, led by the arrogant and power-hungry Richard Lawson, had been harassing him for years. It started with passive-aggressive letters about his unkempt yard, then moved on to threats about violations that didn't apply to him. Jason had ignored them, knowing full well that their authority ended at his property line. But it seemed that Richard and his cronies weren't satisfied with just writing letters. They wanted to flex their power, even if it meant breaking the law. One afternoon, Jason returned home from a long business trip, eager to take his boat out for a relaxing ride, only to find it was gone. At first, he thought maybe it had been stolen, but a sinking feeling in his gut told him to check with the HOA office. Sure enough, when he stormed into their tiny, overpriced building, Richard sat behind his polished mahogany desk, wearing a smug expression. "Oh, that eyesore? Yes, we had it removed," he said, barely looking up from his paperwork. Jason's blood boiled. "Removed? That boat was on my private property, Richard," he said through gritted teeth. Richard leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head. "You're within the HOA's jurisdiction, Miller. We had multiple complaints, and as per our bylaws, we have the authority to remove unauthorized vehicles." Jason's fist clenched. "I am not part of the HOA. My land is private, and I have legal documentation that says so." Richard smirked. "Well, that's a matter of interpretation." Jason felt a slow, cold rage settle into his bones. "Where's my boat?" Richard shrugged. "Auctioned. It's already been sold." The words hit like a hammer. They had sold his property without his permission. This wasn't just a case of HOA overreach. This was theft. Jason took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Richard had no idea who he had just screwed over. Jason wasn't some helpless homeowner who would take this lying down. He was a real estate developer, a man who knew every legal loophole and property law in the book. And now, he was going to make Richard Lawson and his corrupt HOA pay for every single mistake they had just made. Jason Miller had always believed in playing fair, but there was nothing fair about what the Lakewood Ridge HOA had done to him. They had crossed a line, his property line, and stolen from him in broad daylight, under the thin guise of community enforcement. But Jason wasn't some hapless homeowner too scared to fight back. He was a real estate developer who had spent years maneuvering through complex property laws and contracts, and now he was about to turn that knowledge into a weapon. The moment Richard Lawson smirked and told him his boat had been auctioned, Jason knew there was no turning back. They hadn't just towed his boat, they had sold it. This wasn't a fine, this wasn't a slap on the wrist, this was grand theft. The HOA had acted completely outside their authority, and Jason intended to make them pay. The legal trap. Jason didn't waste any time. As soon as he left the HOA office, he made 3 calls. The first was to his lawyer, Mark Reynolds, a ruthless contract specialist who had shut down more than a few overreaching HOAs in his career. The second was to his private investigator, someone he had worked with before to track down lost assets. And the third? A local journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption in homeowner associations. By that evening, Mark had already drafted a legal complaint. "They have no jurisdiction over your land," he confirmed as Jason read over the paperwork. "Your property deed explicitly states you opted out of the HOA when you purchased the land. That means they had zero legal authority to remove anything from your property, let alone sell it." Jason nodded, his jaw clenched. "How long before we can move forward?" "We can file in the morning," Mark replied. "This is going to be a nightmare for them. They committed fraud, violated property laws, and if we prove they knowingly acted outside their authority, That's a criminal offense. Jason smirked. Good. Let's take this all the way. Finding the boat. While Mark worked on the legal side, Jason focused on tracking down his stolen boat. His private investigator, Tom Becker, was a former police officer with a knack for finding things that didn't want to be found. You're in luck, Tom told him the next morning. The HOA didn't go through an official auction house. They sold it privately, which means there's no legal paper trail. Jason's eyes darkened. Who bought it? Guy named Brian Keller, Tom replied. Owns a luxury marina about 30 miles from here. He bought the boat for pennies, way below market value. Looks like Richard Lawson cut a deal to make it disappear fast. Jason exhaled slowly. They thought they could erase the evidence. That afternoon, Jason drove straight to Keller's marina. The place was high-end, catering to wealthy boat owners who paid top dollar for premium docking and storage. Jason walked into the main office, where a well-dressed man in his 50s greeted him. Brian Keller? Jason asked, keeping his voice steady. The man nodded. That's me. What can I do for you? Jason pulled out a copy of his boat's title and placed it on the desk. You bought this boat 2 days ago. The problem is, it was stolen property. Keller frowned, picking up the paperwork. Hold on. I bought this through an HOA auction. It was supposed to be legal. It wasn't, Jason said coldly. They had no right to sell it. And now, you're in possession of stolen property. Keller's expression darkened. Damn it. I knew that price was too good to be true. He sighed, shaking his head. Look, I don't want any trouble. If it was stolen, I'll return it. But I need proof. Jason slid another document across the table. Here's my legal claim. My lawyer is filing a formal lawsuit against the HOA as we speak. If you return the boat now, you'll be in the clear. If you don't, you will be named in the lawsuit. Keller didn't hesitate. I don't need that kind of trouble. Take your boat. Jason smiled for the first time in days. Turning the tables. With his boat back in his possession, Jason was ready for the next step, taking down the HOA. The lawsuit was already public knowledge, thanks to the news coverage that was spreading across the community. Homeowners, many of whom had suffered under Richard's leadership, were furious. At the next HOA meeting, Jason made his entrance. The room was packed, angry residents, local reporters, even a legal observer from the county. Richard Lawson sat at the front, his usual smug expression gone. He looked pale, nervous. Jason walked straight to the microphone. I'd like to address the illegal actions of this HOA, he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. Your president and board members have been overstepping their authority for years, but now they've committed grand theft. They stole my boat, sold it illegally, and tried to cover their tracks. That is a felony. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard stood up sharply. This is a private matter, Jason. No, it's not. Jason cut him off. You involved the entire community when you started using HOA funds and rules as your own personal weapon. He turned toward the audience. How many of you have been unfairly fined? How many of you have been threatened? How many of you have had your property seized? A murmur turned into outrage. People started shouting, telling their own stories. An elderly couple spoke about being fined thousands of dollars for minor landscaping issues. A single mother talked about being harassed over a playset in her yard. This ends now, Jason continued. I'm suing the HOA, and I'm calling for a vote to remove the board entirely. Richard's face was beet red. This is ridiculous. The HOA has the right to. No, Richard, Jason cut in. You don't. And the state attorney's office is going to agree with me. He turned back to the crowd. I've already submitted a formal complaint. An official investigation into the HOA's finances starts next week. And guess what? If they find evidence of fraud, people are going to jail. The room exploded. People started chanting for the board to resign. Reporters scribbled furiously. Some of the board members quietly slipped out, realizing they were finished. Richard looked like a cornered rat. You can't do this. Jason smiled. I already did. The meeting ended with a formal vote, and the results were overwhelming. The entire HOA board was removed, and Jason's lawsuit moved forward with dozens of homeowners joining as co-plaintiffs. By the time Jason left the meeting, the entire HOA was collapsing from within, and Richard Lawson, he was facing criminal charges. Jason walked back to his boat, parked right where it belonged, on his private land. He ran his hand over the hull, exhaling slowly. Justice had been served. The HOA was falling apart, and Jason Miller wasn't done yet. He had spent years tolerating their harassment, their unjust fines, and their relentless attempts to control land that wasn't theirs to govern. But now, he had the upper hand, and he wasn't just going to win. He was going to make sure the HOA never recovered. The lawsuit was already moving forward. The former board members were scrambling to save themselves, and Richard Lawson was days away from facing criminal charges. But Jason wasn't satisfied with just removing them. He wanted to make sure no HOA could ever try this again. The morning after the explosive meeting, Jason met with his attorney, Mark Reynolds, to go over the next phase of the lawsuit. The case was airtight. The HOA had acted illegally, and their financial records, now under state investigation, showed years of fraud, extortion, and illegal property seizures. Even homeowners who had never spoken out were now coming forward, sharing their own horror stories. Many had paid thousands in bogus fees, believing they had no choice. Now, with Jason leading the charge, they were finally fighting back. Mark leaned back in his chair, reviewing the latest legal documents. With the number of people joining the lawsuit, we're looking at a massive payout, Jason. If we win, and we will, the HOA's entire fund is going to be drained in settlements. Jason smirked. Good. I want them bankrupt. Every dollar they stole should be returned. Mark nodded. Richard Lawson is already in trouble, but if we push this hard enough, he'll never be allowed to run another HOA again. Jason tapped his fingers against the desk. That's not enough. I want permanent changes in how HOAs operate. This case should set a legal precedent. No more unchecked power. No more shady bylaws that let them steal people's property. They should be held accountable, just like any other business. Mark smiled. We can make that happen. That afternoon, Jason took his fight national. He gave interviews to news stations, exposing the corruption within HOAs and calling for stricter regulations. The more he spoke, the bigger the movement grew. Social media exploded with stories from homeowners who had been victimized by abusive HOAs. One viral post summed it up perfectly. HOAs have too much power. Jason Miller is proving that they're not untouchable. It's time we take back our homes. The message spread like wildfire, and soon, politicians were paying attention. A state senator even reached out, asking Jason to testify about HOA corruption. Richard Lawson, meanwhile, was panicking. With the HOA bankrupt, the lawsuit moving forward, and a criminal investigation looming, he had no escape. He tried resigning, but it was too late. The damage was done. The county had frozen the HOA's assets pending fraud charges, and Richard was personally liable for some of the missing funds. A week later, Jason got a call from Mark. "You're going to love this," he said with a chuckle. Richard Lawson just cut a deal with the state attorney. He's agreed to plead guilty to fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. Jason laughed. So, he's actually going to jail? Looks like it, Mark confirmed. 2 years minimum. Jason exhaled slowly, satisfaction settling over him. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. Richard had abused his power for years, ruining people's lives without a second thought. Now, he was finally paying the price. And the best part? The Lakewood Ridge HOA was officially dissolved. No more fines. No more threats. No more power-hungry board members. The community was finally free. To celebrate, Jason threw a massive neighborhood barbecue. The turnout was huge. Homeowners, former HOA victims, even a few local officials who had been following the case. The atmosphere was electric, filled with relief, laughter, and the undeniable energy of victory. Jason stood on his boat, now back where it belonged, looking out at the crowd. Someone handed him a beer, and he raised it high. "To taking back what's ours," he called out. The crowd cheered, the sound echoing across the lake. Richard Lawson and his HOA had thought they could bully him into submission. They had thought they could steal from him and get away with it. They had been wrong. As Jason leaned back, taking a long sip of his drink, he smiled. For the first time in years, he could finally enjoy his land without interference. No HOA, no threats, just freedom.